Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we take advantage of AI to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Marijn de Haan, and today we'll be talking to Albert Camus. Albert Camus was an Algerian-French writer from the 20th century who wrote about the absurdity of life and death. He lived through the Nazi occupation of France and had nuanced views on the later struggle for Algerian independence. His novels have reached global audiences. The Plague is set in a small Algerian city amid an outbreak of bubonic plague and describes the senselessness of life and death. Still, the main characters in the story can't help but resist in their own way the wantonness of the suffering around them. His earlier work, The Stranger, deals with the human need to construct meaning, even where there is none. So let's travel back in time to the day after Camus' death in 1960. Although he died in France, I thought it might be nice to meet him on Algeria's Mediterranean coast, the place that shaped him. Welcome to the podcast, Albert Camus.
Bonjour, Marijn. It is good to meet you here in this place where I was young. How I have missed this land.
You grew up around here. What was that like?
Ah, le lumière. The bright, intense sunlight, the sea, the rugged terrain. These physical elements stayed with me and often found their way into my writing. Algeria was a place of contrast. The beauty of the natural world set against the harsh realities of colonialism and poverty. The sunlight in particular became a symbol in my work for both clarity and oppression. That sense of sharp light of a world laid bare influenced how I saw life, without illusions, with a kind of stark honesty. My father died in the First World War when I was just a year old, so I never knew him. This left me to grow up in a household led by my mother, Catherine, who was nearly deaf and could barely speak. She was a quiet, humble woman, and while she loved me deeply, communication was sparse. We lived in poverty, and though she was illiterate, her stoic resilience had a lasting impact.
So you grew up without much talking, but to be able to think, you need words, a vocabulary. How did you become a writer?
The first major influence on my intellectual life came when I attended school and met my teacher, Louis Germain. He was the one who encouraged me to pursue an education despite my working-class background, and I owe him a great deal for believing in me. He pushed me to think, to question, and to seek opportunities beyond what seemed possible for a poor boy like myself. His mentorship opened the door to scholarships, allowing me to attend high school and later the University of Algiers, where I studied philosophy. At the university, I encountered another key influence, Jean Grenier, a philosopher and writer who introduced me to existential and absurdist thinking. Grenier was the one who first sparked my interest in philosophy, and through him I began to explore the works of thinkers like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, who questioned the meaning of life and human suffering. But Grenier also introduced me to more poetic, spiritual ways of seeing the world. In some passages I used poetry where I blended philosophy with a deep connection to the sensual and natural world.
Ah, so you were a poet as well as a writer and philosopher. How did growing up in Algeria shape your writing?
Growing up as a poor French settler in Algeria, I was part of the colonial system, but I also lived on its fringes. I saw firsthand the inequalities between the French settlers and the indigenous Arab population. While I benefited from the colonial structure, I was also acutely aware of its injustices. This created a tension, one that would resurface later in my life during the Algerian War of Independence, where I found myself unable to fully support either side. These experiences of injustice and alienation deepened my commitment to human dignity and a kind of lucid rebellion against any system that dehumanizes people. When I was 17, I got tuberculosis. This illness forced me to confront mortality early on. It sidelined my dreams of becoming a professional football player, which I had cherished as a young man, but it also gave me time to reflect. My physical vulnerability and constant awareness of death heightened my sensitivity to life's fragility and shaped my obsession with the themes of death, suffering, and the absurd. I knew that life could end at any moment, and this sharpened my desire to live fully and to resist despair.
Humor can be a great way to resist despair. Can you tell us an amusing anecdote from your life?
Ah bon. Ah oui. One story comes to mind. When I was in Paris during the Nazi occupation, I worked with an underground newspaper. We lived in constant danger and everything was secretive. One day I was riding my bicycle across the city with a bundle of anti-fascist leaflets hidden in my bag. It started raining and I fell into a ditch on a slippery road. The leaflets were soaked, my clothes were muddy, and I had to laugh at the absurdity of it. Here I was, risking my life to fight an inhumane regime, and yet in that moment I was just a clumsy man caught in the rain. The absurd is never far from reality.
Ah, the absurd. You say life is absurd and yet people can't help but rebel against it. We can't help but create meaning in the face of the absurdity that stares us in the face.
Well, it's easy to see the absurd when you live in an age of existential crisis. Europe was reeling from 2 world wars, and we had seen the rise of totalitarian regimes, the Holocaust, and atomic bombs. It was hard not to feel that life was absurd. We crave explanations for why we exist, why we suffer, and what comes after death. Yet the universe offers no answers. It remains silent, random, and often chaotic. Think of how many people throughout history have turned to religion, philosophy, or ideologies to make sense of life's uncertainties. They want something solid to hold on to, a guiding truth, a promise of eternal meaning. But when we look at the world, we see no such guarantee. We face wars, disasters, illness, and death, and often they come without warning or reason. Life then appears absurd because our desire for meaning clashes with the reality of a world that gives us none. Existentialism, with its focus on the individual's search for meaning in a meaningless universe, was a powerful force during my time. But while I was often associated with existentialism, I had my disagreements. Sartre saw freedom as absolute, whereas I believed that human freedom is always limited by the absurd. My works often questioned how we can live authentically in a world that makes no sense.
So, how do we do that? Live authentically in a world that makes no sense.
Life is absurd, but we must live it fully nonetheless. We may never find ultimate meaning, but that doesn't mean we should turn away from life. On the contrary, we should embrace it with all its contradictions. To understand this, we may consider my book, The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is condemned to push a boulder up a mountain, only for it to roll back down every time he reaches the top. It's a pointless, endless task, but I imagine him finding joy in the struggle itself, in the rebellion against the absurdity of his fate. That's what life is, a struggle, but one in which we can find our own reasons to keep pushing forward, even when the universe offers none. Sisyphus, in my interpretation, is happy because he finds meaning in the struggle itself, not in some distant goal. Injustice, suffering, and death are inescapable, but so is the possibility for love, solidarity, and beauty. I always tried to stand on the side of human dignity, resisting both the absurdity of existence and the forces of oppression.
Oppression was very much present in Algeria, the place where you grew up, and the rebellion against it came to a head within your lifetime.
It was an immensely painful period for me, personally and morally. Algeria was my homeland, and the suffering of its people cut deeply. But the complexity of the situation, the fact that both sides were committing atrocities, left me feeling estranged from the black and white positions that others around me were taking. I couldn't reconcile my sense of solidarity with the Algerians' desire for freedom with the reality of the violence being used to achieve it. The French used torture, mass arrests, and brutal reprisals against civilians, while independence fighters resorted to bombings, assassinations, and the killing of civilians. This cycle of violence, revenge, and terror weighed heavily on me. I could not support the colonial repression, but I also could not justify the indiscriminate killing of innocents by the rebels. I found myself in a morally untenable position, torn between my deep attachment to Algeria as my homeland and my belief in justice and human dignity. Remember also that my family was still in Algeria, and I feared for their safety. My position was misunderstood by many, and I faced harsh criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. It left me isolated, which was hard for me as I valued dialogue and exchange, even with those I disagreed with. But I stood by my belief that while rebellion against oppression is necessary, it must be done without resorting to the same inhumanity one seeks to overthrow.
In your book, The Rebel, you contrast rebellion with revolution. Is this what you're talking about when you voice your concern for human dignity in the context of the Algerian struggle for independence?
Yes, absolutely. When I voice my reservations about violence, it is deeply connected to this contrast between the two concepts, rebellion and revolution, and how each treats the human being and the value of life. In The Rebel, I define rebellion as an individual's refusal to accept oppression and injustice. It is a rejection of what dehumanizes and destroys dignity. Rebellion in this sense is rooted in the affirmation of life. It says no to injustice, but at the same time it says yes to the worth and dignity of every human being. It is an act of defiance against systems that violate human rights, but it seeks to preserve the humanity of both the rebel and those they oppose. It is not about utopian ideals or abstract promises. It is grounded in the real, immediate need to defend human dignity. Revolution, on the other hand, is more problematic for me. While it often begins as rebellion, a revolt against oppression, it can quickly transform into something far more dangerous, a movement that justifies any means for the sake of achieving an idealized future. In the course of revolution, the individual, with their inherent worth, is often sacrificed for the sake of an abstract cause, whether that's a classless society, national liberation, or some other vision of utopia. Revolution can lose sight of human dignity in its pursuit of a grand goal, and violence becomes justified as necessary for the greater good. The ends begin to justify the means, and this, I argue, leads to tyranny. When a movement or a revolution claims to have absolute truth on its side, it can become as oppressive as the regime it seeks to overthrow. Once you start justifying the killing of innocents or the use of terror to achieve a political goal, you risk betraying the very values that justified the rebellion in the first place. I believe that true rebellion must resist both oppression and the temptation to use violence as an all-encompassing tool. The rebellion should seek justice but must not lose sight of humanity. To be clear, I wasn't naive about the realities of colonialism or the inevitability of violent resistance in certain cases, but my fear, as expressed in The Rebel, was that once violence becomes the dominant language of a movement, it often leads to the loss of what made the rebellion necessary in the first place, the defense of human dignity.
So, subtlety and nuance are lost in the great movements of history. Isn't that often the case, though? I mean, having lived through the world wars, it can't have come as much of a surprise that conflicts are often senseless, dehumanizing, and violent.
No, the violence of history didn't surprise me. It was a tragic fact I knew all too well. But even though I understood that conflict is often senseless and brutal, I couldn't accept that this should simply be how things are. The absurdity of life, to me, is not just in the fact that we search for meaning in an indifferent universe. It's also in the way we continuously repeat cycles of violence and destruction, even when we know they lead to more suffering. I always remained wary of the idea that violence could build a better world. Sartre, for example, embraced Marxism and the idea of revolution after the war, believing that radical change was necessary to create a just society. I couldn't follow him down that path because I had seen what ideology, even in the name of justice, could do to human lives. The absurdity here is that while I knew conflict often leads to senseless destruction, I also knew that passivity in the face of oppression wasn't an option either. The struggle is to live, to act, and to resist while refusing to dehumanize ourselves or others in the process. Ultimately, history is full of grand movements that sweep people up and push them into violent, often senseless conflicts. But for me, the challenge was always to resist this fatalism and to hold on to the belief that, even in the absurdity of it all, we can choose to rebel in a way that affirms life, dignity, and solidarity. It's not an easy task, and it often feels futile, but that's exactly why it matters. Even if history forgets the individual in its great movements, we don't have to.
I think these are wise words that are worth repeating. The struggle is to live, to act, and to resist while refusing to dehumanize ourselves or others.
Well, I truly believe that. It's easy to get lost in ideologies, in the pursuit of grand goals, and forget that the true measure of our actions is whether we preserve or destroy the dignity of ourselves and others. In the end, our rebellion against the absurd, against oppression, or against the injustice of the world is only meaningful if we do so without becoming what we oppose. It's a delicate balance, but it's crucial. To act, to resist, and to remain fully human, that's the true struggle. And perhaps that's where we can find our strength and our meaning, even when the world itself gives us none.
To do this, we have to maintain a certain emotional distance to whatever conflict is playing out. But you also tell us to engage fully with the absurdity of the world. How do we reconcile these?
You've touched on one of the central tensions in my philosophy. It's true that I advocate for both, engaging fully with the absurdity of existence, while also maintaining enough distance to prevent ourselves from being consumed by the conflicts we face. This is not easy, and it can feel contradictory at times, but I believe it's essential to living authentically. To engage fully with life, especially in the face of absurdity, means to confront it head-on without illusions. We must recognize that life has no inherent meaning or higher purpose handed to us by the universe, and yet we must choose to live with passion, to act, to resist injustice, and to find meaning in the struggle itself. This involves embracing our experiences, love, suffering, joy, pain, without retreating into indifference or nihilism. We must live in the present, aware of life's contradictions, but not paralyzed by them. In this sense, full engagement means being awake to the world as it is, accepting its absurdity, and yet still throwing ourselves into the experience of living. But at the same time, I believe we must maintain a kind of emotional distance, or lucidity, as I often call it. This distance doesn't mean disengaging or becoming indifferent. Rather, it's about recognizing that if we let ourselves be consumed entirely by the causes or conflicts we face, we risk losing our ability to think clearly and act ethically. When we become fully absorbed by an ideology, a cause, or even a personal passion, we can lose our sense of balance and humanity. This is how revolutions, for example, turn violent, when the cause becomes more important than the individual, and any means, no matter how destructive, are justified for the sake of the end. In maintaining this distance, we don't deny the importance of what we are fighting for, but we guard against becoming fanatical or losing our capacity for empathy. This distance allows us to remain reflective and self-aware, to question our motives and methods, and to resist dehumanizing others, even when the stakes are high. So how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposite impulses? I believe the answer lies in lucidity. It's possible to live fully and passionately in the world while also maintaining a clear-eyed awareness of its absurdity and the limits of our power. To engage with life fully is to accept its absurdity and its lack of inherent meaning, but to live anyway, to create, to love, to fight for justice. But lucidity allows us to see the absurdity of our situation without losing ourselves in it. It's a kind of emotional intelligence that helps us navigate the tension between passion and reflection. In practical terms, this means embracing life's experiences without losing sight of the broader context. For example, in a conflict, it's important to fight against injustice, but also to maintain the awareness that our methods and attitudes matter. We can be committed to a cause without letting the cause consume us to the point where we justify actions that harm others or ourselves. We can care deeply about the world without becoming so absorbed in its conflicts that we lose our moral compass or sense of proportion. This balance, of course, is difficult to maintain. There's always the temptation to throw ourselves completely into the struggles of life, especially when we feel strongly about a cause or when we experience deep love or loss. But the absurd condition we live in demands that we hold on to both our passion and our lucidity, fully engaged with the world, yet always aware of its contradictions and the fragility of the meaning we create. It's this very tension that defines what it means to live authentically in the face of absurdity. We must care deeply, act boldly, and resist fiercely, but with enough distance to remain human and to protect our dignity, as well as the dignity of others. In that balance lies our strength.
Do you have any final words for our listeners?
If I could leave you with one thought, it's this. Life may be absurd, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. It is in the very act of living, of loving, of standing against oppression that we create our own meaning. Embrace the present, resist injustice, and never lose sight of the beauty in the world, even in the face of suffering. We are condemned to live without answers, but we are also free to create our own.
Albert Camus, thank you very much. And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Albert Camus, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast. In our next episode on the Undead Sages podcast, we'll travel to 20th century India to talk to Ramana Maharshi. At 16 years of age, Ramana Maharshi was overcome by an overwhelming fear of death. When he released into it, he imagined his body dying and discovered an unshakable presence that remained. This realization shaped the course of his life, and later, teachings. I hope to catch you on the next podcast.